Welcome, everybody. My name is Kate McGregor, and I am the co-chair of the Global Humanities Alliance and the Associate Dean International for the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people, on whose unceded lands we are presenting from tonight from the Melbourne side of this team. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, elders, and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who've been instrumental to our knowledge journey at the University of Melbourne. And I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous knowledge holders to our knowledge at the university. I would also like to welcome everybody from across the Global Humanities Alliance to this event. So selamat datang, sawasdi, namaste. For those of you not yet familiar with the Global Humanities Alliance, this is an initiative that works to join together humanities and social science scholars across 8 partner universities to enable international partnerships that address pressing global challenges. So the 8 partner universities in alphabetical order include Ashoka University in India, Universitas Católica Chile in Chile, Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia, Manchester University in the UK, University of Nairobi in Kenya, University of Melbourne, Mahidol University in Thailand, Toronto University in Canada. The mission of the Global Humanities Alliance is to raise the profile and social and political impact of humanities and social sciences through an emphasis on a program of research and teaching that takes up global issues, incorporates diverse global perspectives, and brings scholars and students together for critical conversations. So a core value of us at the GHA is that by combining our complementary and distinctive strengths, we can better address key global challenges and showcase the differences that humanities and social sciences and liberal arts make to the world. Across the Global Humanities Alliance, we have connected over 70 scholars working on 4 key themes, of which each of which is represented by one working group. So today we are delighted to present to you the first event for the working group under the theme of Decolonising Knowledge, which I am co-chairing with Professor Winnie Mutala from the University of Nairobi. And this is the first of a 2-part roundtable entitled, What Does Decolonising Knowledge Mean from Different Geographical and Disciplinary Positions? So part 1 of this roundtable series involves speakers from 4 partner universities, Ashoka, Universitas Gadjah Mada, Mahidol University and Melbourne University. Part 2, to be held later this year, will involve speakers from UC Chile, Manchester, Nairobi and Toronto universities. So before I introduce the speakers briefly, I'd like to remind audience members and speakers that this is a webinar and it is being recorded with the permission of our speakers. The recording will also be circulated across the Global Humanities Alliance for wider use for staff and students. I would like to ask panelists, I'm going to ask panelists also a series of questions. And if you have questions arising throughout the roundtable, you're welcome to place those in the Q&A. Please indicate in the Q&A if your questions are generally for the panel or for one particular speaker. I would now like to briefly introduce our panelist. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr Lynda Ng, who's from the English program here at the University of Melbourne. She's just turning her camera on. And Lynda is a scholar who specialises in contemporary fiction and Aboriginal literature. She will reflect in this panel today on what decolonisation means in the context of Australian literary studies. Australian literature has historically been understood in terms of the legacy of British colonialism, but in recent decades this orientation has been challenged by the rising strength and popularity of First Nations writing. The influx of First Nations voices forces a sharp reconsideration of Australia's post-colonial status and gestures towards the complex nature of decolonial practice. And also we have Dr Luqman Nul Hakim, a lecturer from the Department of International Relations and Director of the Institute of International Studies at Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. And AIM's research covers various issues within the development, security, democracy nexus. His latest books include Islamism and the Quest for Hegemony in Indonesia, The Global South, Reflection and Vision for International Relations Studies. And Luqman Ayim is going to talk to us about what does decolonising knowledge mean from the perspective of Indonesia and also the discipline of international relations. Our third speaker on the roundtable will be Dr Nuntamon Kutalad, who currently works at the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia at Mahidol University in Thailand, and she's a lecturer in the MA in Museum Studies and Cultural Studies programs. and she will reflect on the formation of museums in Thai and Western world contexts and how this was not very different in many aspects. But she's going to speak to us in this roundtable under the topic of Thai museums and decolonisation, and what this means in the context particularly of Thai museology, its formation, and how the concept of decolonisation is seen and interpreted in museum practice in Thailand. And finally, we have Professor Projit Bihari Mukharji, who is a professor and head of Department of History at Ashoka University in India. And his work focuses on histories of the human sciences in South Asia. His most recent monograph, Brown Skins, White Coats, Race Science in India, 1920 to 66, won the Pfizer Award and was shortlisted for the Pickstone Prize and received an honourable mention for the Scaglione Prize in South Asian Studies. And he's also recently been a Guggenheim Fellow and currently serves as co-editor of the journal ISIS, the official journal of the History of Science Society. And he's going to reflect critically on what decolonising knowledge might mean in India in relation to the area of study that he specialises in, and also offer us some potential critiques of a potential takeover of the decolonial or decolonising agenda as well. And finally, amongst the people on our panel is also Dr. Israel Hollas, who will be helping us field questions, who's another member of our working group on decolonising knowledge. So after that introduction, I'm now going to jump immediately into the questions, and I'm going to be asking a series of questions to each of the panelists and then ask them to speak in turn. So first of all, I'm starting with you, Lynda, and I'm going to ask you please to reflect on what does decolonising knowledge mean from the different geographic locations that you're based in and the country that you study.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this roundtable. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm currently speaking from unceded Gadigal land up in Sydney, and of course pay my respects to elders past and present. Decolonising knowledge in the Australian context involves something close to code switching. There is the post-colonial view of Australia, the one that emphasises our history as an English penal colony and that acknowledges the difficulties of disentangling Australian national identity from a persistent, inculcated idea of Australians as British subjects. Then there is the view of Australia as a sovereign nation and modern state whose formation was only made possible by the illegal dispossession of the First Nations peoples that were here when the English arrived. The myth of terra nullius really sets Australia apart. I think it's important to remember that the English themselves deviated from their usual protocols for colonisation when they declared Australia a terra nullius. In their previous efforts to colonise new lands, the English acknowledged, at least in principle, that land should be purchased from its original inhabitants. In New Zealand, the British signed the Treaty of Waitangi with Maori leaders in 1840. This document functions as an important foundational text for the nation. It formally recognises the entry of English settlers into New Zealand society. No such treaty was ever negotiated here in Australia. By contrast, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people only gained the right to vote in 1962, and a unanimous nationwide vote in the 1967 referendum was required before First Nations people could be acknowledged as part of the population and counted in the census here. Indigenous activism in this country has been a long, difficult road of trying to gain recognition that First Nations people exist and to draw attention to the conditions in which many are forced to live. The anthropologist, and this is back in the 60s, but the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner said that, and I quote, he said, "Inattention on such a scale cannot possibly be explained by absent-mindedness. It is a structural matter, a view from a window which has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of the landscape." Decolonising knowledge in Australia therefore involves addressing a dual legacy of colonialism. The biases of Australian history and its self-image need to be remedied. This is work being done on many fronts, but particularly by First Nations authors and scholars whose writing provides a counterbalance to the official record. On a deeper structural level, Australia needs to find some way to integrate or engage with both narratives, the post-colonial version of Australia and the version of Australia as a colonial power that continues to oppress and marginalise its First Nations peoples. Integration may not be possible in the way we are used to thinking about it. In a Western sense, this always implicitly seems to mean assimilation. This is where code switching becomes a useful way to think about it or approach it, I think, because these two viewpoints may, at heart, be irreconcilable. Decolonizing knowledge may mean finding ways of being at peace with this discordance, not aiming for a simplified singular narrative, but allowing these multiple narratives to exist as equal, if different, truths. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynda. Great start. And now I'd like to turn to Ayam to talk about Indonesia.
Thanks. Thank you, Kate, and it's great to be here. When we talk about decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia, we need to remember that it's not a single movement or a single project, but it's frequently overlapping and even contradictory. Decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia, often labeled awkwardly as pribumisasi or indigenizations of knowledge, had emerged productively during the 1970s and 1990s with different orientations. Generally speaking, we can roughly categorize this project into three different manifestations. The first manifestation emerged as a response to the dominance of modernization theory in the late 1970s. There was an aspiration to build a more transformative-oriented social science, and the prompt questions they really want to address was, how can social science and humanities contribute to solving human problem? And in this context of the new order developmentalism's consolidation, social science are often treated as ancillary science, serving only to legitimize government policies while doing some trivial intervention in society, but keep covering the fact that the growing social problem, such as poverty, inequality, were integral consequences of state capitalism. And this trend inspired by similar developments in other regions, especially in Latin America with dependency theory. But the difference between these two spaces of knowledge productions is vivid. Dependency theory was built on a political economic framework to reflect unjust practices of development, especially following the integration of the space into global market, while the indigenizations of social science in Indonesia is more inward-looking, not situating Indonesia in the global structures. And as a result, by criticizing, the mantra of one fit for all of the modernization theory, this project had indeed challenged the universal status of Western knowledge in developing nations, but it does not necessarily mean that the project went further to disarticulate the hegemony of Euro-US centrism in Indonesia. And unlike dependency theories as well, the pre-Bumisasi project or indigenizations of knowledge project are relatively inward-looking and fail to produce a body of knowledge that offer a new alternative understanding of politics. The second trend of decolonizing knowledge emerged under the horizons of the debate between Islamic versus secular-based knowledge. It's quite funny in this context. And the context was following the Iranian revolutions in 1979 and the development of Islamic movement in the Middle East. Discussing Islam in broader social life gained currency in Indonesia that contributed to the phenomenon that scholars often call as the Islamizations of societies. This was also situated in the context when the government banned any political activities on campuses that made mosques and Islamic issues the safest space at the height of authoritarian regime. Figures like Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, the Palestinian-American philosopher, Said Naguib Alatas were new idols among this generation. The formalizations of Islam and the dominance of urban middle class on Islamic discourse in this country as a result of Islamizations of societies prompted figure like Abdurrahman Wahid, the leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, often labeled as the traditional Muslim, to promote the idea of pribumisasi Islam or indigenizations of Islam. The basic idea is that Islam is not equal to Arab, but has been assimilated into the country with complex manifestation. His advocacy for the difference of Islam, Islam is not single face, had politically improved the leverage of the traditional Muslim in coloring Islamic discourse in Indonesia. This second trend resulted into two main characters of decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia. First, instead of creating a new hegemonic block of knowledge, these Islamizations of knowledge brought about polarizations among Muslims. those who advocate the formalizations of Islam, Islamizations of science, and so on and so forth, and the advocate of the multifaceted Islam. And the second one, it resulted into insularity of knowledge, meaning that failed to address the concrete problem experienced by general people and failed to offer a distinct body of knowledge that was explored and developed from Indonesians' experience. The third trend was associated with the publications of Edward Said Orientalisms and the popularity of postmodern literatures. Said Orientalisms that revealed the power knowledge nexus on how East is defined by the West to maintain the hierarchy of power opened the space for the development of knowledge productions known as Occidentalism. Meanwhile, the popularity of modernism's literature that celebrated the death of universalisms or grand narrative had been responded by the wave of knowledge production under the banner of the go to the local. The jargon was go to the locals. So the character from this knowledge production, this third enterprise of knowledge productions, are twofold. First, while this trend enriched descriptive studies, mostly in anthropology and sociology of the locals, and brought up the issues which had been suppressed by modernization's interventions, but they mostly, had little political implications. They enrich in descriptive analysis, but no political implications. And the second character for this third enterprise was that the parochializations of knowledge that tend to be developed under culturally essential assumption of the universal local logic, and no dialogue, not even a synthesis between their findings and the dominant body of knowledge. I think those three characters of decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia so far.
Thank you so much, Aim, for covering a lot in a short time there. Let's move on to Nuntamon, please, from Mahidol University.
Hello, everyone. From this question, I would say in the big picture first, based on the geographical location, which is Southeast Asia, and with my country, Thailand, which in the colonial time we call Siam. And with this topic, decolonizing knowledge, it's kind of very debatable topic a lot, that because part of our knowledge, like from when we learn from school, we have been told that Thailand or Siam have never been colonized, and then but on the other hand, when the history knowledge developed, from the researcher, some said, it's not colonized, but actually it's kind of have the power or impact from colonialism as well, and at the same time it creates somebody still see even our country like Siam colonized or kind of have a power over the other country in the Southeast Asia together. So basically, I would say if we're checking the map, a map of Siam since the beginning of 1782, which is the beginning of the Ratanakosin era, with the King Rama the first, and somebody might have seen that the map of Siam at that time, including the area of some countries like Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, or even Vietnam, but just part of it. But according to the map of the Kingdom of Siam and its dependencies from government survey under the direction of J. McCarthy by order of His Royal Highness Prince Mahidol University in the 19th century. It says use the word dependencies, which is I agree with this term, rather than Siam has a power over those countries, because still with this, the part of some of this country is a part, and they still have has some degrees of their own autonomy. So, but and we have to look at the way that the governance system at that time as well. So, but what to kind of argue with the argument that we have not been colonized, and why we kind of have power over other country, I would say it's kind of if we want to look deeply in the history knowledge, I would say it's kind of called the historical disputes over territories, which is it's just like kind of could be seen as an adjustment colonial power at that time, because we have all known that like with the colonialism it's kind of terrifying at that time, and as the let's say the ruler of the area or territories, we all try to protect our land as much as possible. So it's kind of there is the way that the ruler from each area, for example, like in the northern of Thailand at this time, Lan Na, Kingdom of Lan Na, it used to be their own like independent, but they have to find the the allies to protect their land as well. But later, like okay, they choose to come with the Kingdom of Siam at that time. So but like so after all, like with the answer that okay, we have been colonized or not. So I think this is the point that it like very subjective and it's individual opinion. So for anyone who like wants to look at the historical story like deeply. But I would say more like after all the dispute like in Siam until like let's say like after all the dispute, the Kingdom of Siam have the kind of government style of the absolute monarchy until 1932, when the King Prachadipok grant the first constitution for the people, let's say. But from since the King Chulalongkorn, the King Rama V, we have set like kind of some the government system, yeah. But since when we move from absolute monarchy to the constitutional democracy, let's say, I see that like there's still like kind of like the government style kind of quite starting to settle, yeah. But it turns out like it's more central, it's kind of centralized administration. With this point of the style, it can be said that in terms of colonization or want to be decolonizing is more, I won't say using the term decolonization in my country, in the kind of the context of my country, but I would say it's more decentralization, yeah, more than this, because after we change the government, the government style, like all the power is in the central, like let's say Bangkok, and then like the central government. And with this point, like it's kind of affect the museology knowledge a little bit, which I will we'll talk later, like with another topic. Yes.
Thank you so much, Nuntamon. Great. I'd now like to hand to Projit from Ashoka University.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kate, for bringing us all together. So I think in terms of decolonization and speaking from India, what I would like to start with is just two clarificatory questions. When was colonialism and who was colonized? And this is a seductively easy couplet that's not as easy to answer, particularly in India, which, as you know, is the world's most populous country. So we have more people than anybody else in the world. And naturally, we have different answers to those questions. So, but what decolonization would mean depends on how you answer those questions. When did colonization start and who was colonized? So to give you some examples, concrete examples of why this matters, for instance, our population is divided. I mean, these are colonial categories and there are problems with the actual categories, but nobody denies the fact that there has been a caste system in place in India for a very long time. And this is a highly exploitative hierarchic system that you're born into, and that there were relatively fewer chances of mobility depending on which caste you were born in. And a large portion of this, so today, people who are categorized as Dalits, which is the lowest rung of the caste order, makes up about 17% of the Indian population. There's another about 8-9% who are classified as tribals, who are even further out of that system. So you put them together, and that's around 17 and another 9, so about 28-29%. And then you have another 12 to 14% of people who are Muslims. And none of these people, and these are three large groups who are sort of within the body politic of India seem to be answering these questions about when did colonialism start and who was colonized differently. So, for instance, a lot of people who subscribe to the Hindu right-wing political dispensation that's now in power would include then all the Muslim kings as colonizers. So one right-wing author recently called the entire period of Muslim kings Middle Eastern colonialism. When India became independent in 1947, one of the very few tribal politicians who was in the Constituent Assembly, Jaipal Singh, said that actually all the upper castes were colonizers. It was the tribal people who were colonized, and that colonization goes back 5,000 years. So, so depending on whether you choose 5,000 years, you choose somewhere around the 13th century, or you choose the 18th century when the British gain a toehold, you have very different chronologies of colonization and different meanings of colonization. And so what decolonization means also then differs. What has happened now is because decolonization has become a project that's quite popular in certain radical circles in settler colonial contexts, that gets exported back to contexts like India, but it doesn't work very well. So to again give you a concrete example, an article by Eve Tuck and Wayne, I'm forgetting the second author's name. Eve Tuck was the first author. The article was called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it made a very powerful case of how decolonization, intellectual decolonization has to be coupled with actually land redistribution, and land should be given back to those who held land before colonization. This would work very well in settler colonial contexts where tribal ownership would at least notionally be returned. But in a place like India, where the Dalits, for instance, were never allowed to hold land, this would go back to a much more oppressive system than we have even today. So it is actually going to help people, a very elite section that held land just before colonization. And so it is actually, even this seemingly radical project has very, very conservative, even majoritarian, elitist undertones in India. So I think, again, the decolonization project, what you mean by it, would depend on answering, first of all, who was colonized and when. And in each place, each country, we would have different answers. And not everybody within the country would have the same answer for that. And acknowledging that would mean that decolonization would look different. And I think there is a need to acknowledge that rather than think that colonization meant the same thing and it just means some kind of like more radical version of throwing out the white settlers. It has to go further than that. It has developed more meanings than that. And I leave it at that, but I can build on it later.
Thank you so much, Projit. That's great. We're getting increasingly complex in our understanding across the globe of how complicated decolonizing might be. Okay, we're now moving to our second question, which, reflecting the topic theme, is now to reflect on what does decolonizing mean for your particular disciplines, and some of the audience members will come from your disciplines. So I'm going back to Lynda now to speak about literature.
Thank you. So yes, my field is literary studies. And in my field, decolonizing knowledge involves challenging deeply ingrained racist and sexist views about literary value and canonicity. The rise of Australian literature in the 20th century was unduly shaped by an artificial image of Australia put forward by the White Australia policy. This policy did exactly as it stated. It aimed to create Australia as a white nation by restricting the immigration of non-European people. It also tried to eradicate the existing Indigenous people or population via assimilationist policies and practices of child removal, which became the stolen generations, as we refer to them today. This vision of, this was a vision of Australia deeply influenced by eugenics, and one often upheld in the literature that was written and celebrated. We really only began to see a diversification in Australian writing once the White Australian policy ended and the country moved towards multiculturalism. So in my field, decolonizing knowledge isn't necessarily about teaching new models or theories, but is achieved through a reading practice. This practice, I thought, would be most visible to show you all. In an Australian literature course that I teach at the University of Melbourne, which is called the Australian Imaginary. So in the past, an Australian literature course would likely begin with colonial era literature, then progress to early nationalist writing, such as the Jindiwarabak movement, then perhaps end with a few nods to multicultural ethnic writing that started to emerge in the 1980s. On my course, students do get a more traditional introduction to Australian literature in the first week with Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life, which was published in 1874. This is a story that is set during a time when when Australia was an English penal colony. But my students read this novel alongside secondary readings from Cassandra Pybus's 2006 monograph, Black Founders, where Pybus observes, and I'm quoting from Pybus, she observes that between 1788 and the middle of the 19th century, almost every convict ship carried people from the African diaspora to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. In the second week, we then study the poetry of Budgeru Nunukul, who became the first Aboriginal person to publish a book of poetry in Australia, and also the first Aboriginal woman to publish a book in Australia, with her 1964 collection, We Are Going. And then in the third week, we study Wang Xiping's The Poison of Polygamy, which is the first Chinese language novel to be published in Australia. It was published in 1909. And it may also be the first Chinese language novel to be published in the West. Wang Xiping's father came to Australia during the gold rushes in the 1850s, and Wang's novel tells a story of this key period in Australian history from a Chinese perspective. So as you can see, introducing Australian literature to students via these three different texts immediately sets up a very different relationship between white Australia and the rest of the country. It overturns the usual linear narrative whereby Australia is discovered by European settlers and then who then subsequently discover Asian migrants and finally towards the end of the 20th century, Aboriginal voices. It shows students that the settler colonial writing we are more familiar with actually arose in a multicultural and multilingual environment, even if the literature itself pointedly ignores this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynda, for taking us further into this topic. Now I'm going back to AIM, Indonesia. Talk about...
Well, I myself work at the Department of International Relations. As a discipline, IR in Indonesia perhaps is the discipline that is highly dominated by Euro-American centrisms, meaning that the chance, to launch the discourse of decolonizing knowledge is strictly limited. And I think it's not only in Indonesia, but also a general phenomenon in this field. Even in 2007, respected IR scholars Barry Buzen and Amitav Acharya published a provocative essay, Why is there no non-Western international relations theory? And of course, the reason is not because, there is no a corpus of knowledge in non-Western hemisphere or about the cultural barriers, but it is about power and material condition from which the parameters of knowledge are set and determined to maintain the dominance of superpower. And when we reflect on Indonesia, there are two interesting historical moments. The first one, of course, we had a great experience in building a global coalition and solidarity among post-colonial states in Asia and Africa, as articulated in the Bandung Conference of 1955, when political leaders commonly built a political framework of to create their respective subjectivity in global politics by articulating, the framework between decolonial state against new imperialist forces. However, in Indonesia, there was a gap between the practice of foreign policy advocated by third world, oriented leaders and knowledge productions endeavors. And this gap, as I will explain, paved the way for the mainstreaming of IR's American model and contributed to the depoliticizations of IR. And like many, other post-colonial countries, the primary orientation for universities, at that time is not to produce knowledge, but to prepare officials to fulfill governmental positions in bureaucracy. IR, of course, was designed to prepare people, to take a position in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the curriculum was mainly administrative and technical. So big historical event in 1955 never been developed into knowledge productions as part of, the practice that developed from the global south, or specifically from Indonesia. And there was an ironic historical moment at this point, because it was only in 1957 IR in Indonesia was reoriented to be more quote unquote scientific and developed as a discipline, not a technical course. And the watershed was when some academic from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, led by Donald Weatherby, supported by Rockefeller Foundations, sent to Indonesia, UGM at the Gadjah Mada University, in Thailand, in Chulalongkorn University, Malaysia, University Kebangsaan, and other ASEAN countries, including Korea, to mainstream American model in IR. And I think this is the moment of canonizations of IR in Indonesia. It's quite weird. People talking about decolonizations, looking back on colonial legacies, but IR colonizations, actually, canonizations of IR started in 1957. So they introduced two important legacies. The first one is the promotions of Morgenthau's realist perspective. I will explain about this later. On the one hand, and the modernist model of development theories as propagated by scholars like Rostow, Gabriel Almond, and later Samuel Huntington. And the legacies of this intervention lasted quite long and become a canonic model of IR in Indonesia. So ironically, scientifications of IR had brought about depoliticizations of IR in the sense that it did not help Indonesia to build a political imaginary to situate itself in global politics. Because for Morgenthau's realisms, IR is about the affairs of big power. There is no place for small states like Indonesia. And this perspective also prescribed the concept of balance of power as prerequisite for, to maintain the peace, meaning to prevent political grouping among decolonial states, except by joining the US alliance or the proxies in the context of Cold War context. Meanwhile, the introductions of modernization, development, democracy studies also made IR inward looking. So this become the new dominant structures of knowledge productions in IR. And this tendency is also strengthened, especially by the changing foreign policy orientations from Sukarno to Suharto after 1965. Instead of projecting Indonesia at global politics through the articulations of antagonism, Suharto sought to primarily focus on domestic development and the search for regional autonomy by establishing ASEAN, which actually an alliance of anti-communist regime in the region. So diplomacy is oriented primarily for development agenda at home. So these two factors, created a dominant structure in IR discourse in Indonesia that by implication closed the door to imagining and constructing a form of political agency to define the role and projections of Indonesia's foreign policy. So I would say that decolonizing knowledge movement in IR must primarily focus on deconstructing these dominant canonic structures of knowledge. And we are at this initial stage. As Gramsci reminds us, in order for a new form of knowledge to flourish, we need to obsolete the existing one, the dominant one. So IR discipline was quite late, compared to other disciplines like history, anthropology, or sociology when we talk about decolonizations of knowledge. I would like to end there.
Thank you so much, Aim. Great links to what Lynda said as well about the canons there. Okay, let's move back to Nuntamon.
Okay. Yes. So from the question, like what decolonizing knowledge means for my field of study, which is museum studies or museology, I would say it's a lot, because and it's affect a lot to Western world, like museums. So because it's kind of a challenge of the white supremacy when we come with the concept of decolonization, and basically is associated with the curatorship and returning artifacts or and food accreditation of the event to, like, it's about like if the museum presents something violent or like kind of insulting the indigenous people or the culture of the country that where they colonized at that time. So and like the movement come a lot after the situation of George Floyd in 2020, Black Lives Matters. So basically, like the action of the museums, like in the Western world, like I would say in terms of Western world, I would say like in England or in the UK, then like where I study quite more than at any other places. So their movement is about make the museum kind of make a workshop or the activities that reduce the racism, yeah, at that time. And it's more about like the repatriation, which is like I said, returning the artifacts or specimen to the motherland. But when look back to the Thai context, again, this is still the intrigue, like kind of debate again. But as I mentioned earlier, that like with the government, like government style, like since the democracy, when we get the constitution, from my research, it's kind of affect the knowledge of the museology or museum studies in Thailand, because with the brief formation of a museum in Thailand, we start like kind of the idea of having the museum during the colonialism, as well as in the King Rama the Fourth, which is King Mongkut, which is the father of King Chulalongkorn. And with these two eras, like with these two the reign of era, like they are, how to say, they face a lot of pressure from colonialism. So with that time, like the King Mongkut has the idea we should have the place to show our culture, like that, to show, let's say, like we have civilization as well as European. So I would say like forming museum at that time is kind of the tool of international relations and for like, let's say, like political issues as well, like I said. So but then later we have the kind of the first public museum, then, because when he formed the museum, it's still a private museum. And then in 1874 we can say that we have the first public museum in Thailand. Yeah, but it took like quite a long time until like 1926 until we changed from that Thai public museum to national museum. Yes. And with this case, it's like, and after we have the museum, we still have no like the organization that kind of help developing the knowledge of museology. Yes. So it's kind of let's say like we have the Department of Museum like 15 years after we having the Thai Public Museum. Yeah. And then with this department, like at the beginning is an independent one until it's moved into the Ministry of Education. Yeah, after like kind of being independent, and then okay, like run by the Ministry of Education. And then, well, it's kind of ironic story a little bit. And then we have the Royal Institute set up to look after the knowledge about archaeology, but not directly to museum yet. And then in 1933, we set up the Fine Art Department. Yeah, and then the Department of Museum is under the Department of Fine Art. And this the Fine Art Department is still under the Ministry of Education. And then until 1940 in Thailand, we start having the Ministry of Culture. Yeah, so like all the Fine Art Department moved to be under the Ministry of Culture. And at some point, like something happened, like with the government or something, like they kind of invalidate the Ministry of Culture, and then like the department moved back to the Ministry of Education. Yeah, until we validate the Ministry of Culture again, like 44 years later. So with this situation, it can be seen that like because like the unstable of the government or like with the system and everything. So this is the how to say the problem, and it affects the way to develop the knowledge of museology. And let's say like with the fine art department is the government government organization, and it took like 5 decades later to have like the optional, let's say, other organizations that support museum knowledge, such as like Sirinthorn Archaeology Center in 1989, and then or Museum Association of Thailand or National Discovery Museum Institution, which is under the Office of Knowledge Management and Development Institution in 2004. So, and this is like, is in terms of, it's not kind, it seems like it's not the kind of decolonization problem directly, but the effect from the colonialism, like it affects the way we government in our own country, and it affects, like, let's say the knowledge of this field. Yes.
Thank you very much, Nuntamon. We might move quickly on to Projit now to reflect on your discipline, Projit, as well.
Sure, thanks. So my discipline is the history of science. And I think the best way that I could sort of address the question is through maybe 4 moments from the relationship of post-colonial India with science. I'll start with the moment of independence, when we gained independence in 1947. First Prime Minister Nehru is, he is a big promoter of something called scientific temper. He resented the fact that there was this depiction of Indians as otherworldly spiritualists who were sort of out of touch with science, and we were only sitting under trees and doing, like, I don't know, snake charming or whatever else. And so he promoted science, sort of big S science, and he wanted everybody to get into the sciences, and he called it promoting scientific temper. He also called big dams he built in many places the temples of modernity. He said that the temples of New India are not going to be temples you go and worship in, but these big hydroelectric power plants, big factories that we set up to modernize and catch up with the West. Now, sooner rather than later, there emerged also critiques of this, because this created these big technological projects, displaced people, created environmental hazards. And so there started emerging a critique of that. And so people became a little more, it mainly came out of a green movement where people were criticizing science and saying that we need to find more ecologically sustainable ways of living with nature rather than these massive technological edifices. So there was a kind of second round of decolonization, saying that technology modernization model, this is along the lines that Luqman was saying, that this is a Western model and we need to find other models. So that then prevailed in the 1970s to some extent, I would say, into the 80s. By the 1990s, we have quite a dramatic shift in our political landscape with the rise of right-wing populist governments, which now hold power. And they, again, reinvent this as the critique of Western science, is saying science is Western, and we'll do it, but we need to put it at par with what they start calling IKS, or indigenous, or sometimes Indian knowledge systems. Now, this Indian knowledge system has a couple of aspects to it. One is, of course, the promotion of things that would have looked unscientific earlier, like now there are university researchers seeing whether cow urine has therapeutic properties, because cow is an animal that the majority population worships here, and they're hell-bent on proving that cow urine has lots of good things to offer. So there are actually resources being devoted to this. On the other hand, what's happened is, in the name of Indian knowledge system, once again, going back to the previous thing that I was saying for the previous question, who is Indian enough, has become a question. So it's become very high caste Hindu Sanskritic knowledge that has upper caste Hindu genealogy that's being presented as Indian knowledge system. And anything that grates against that is being gradually marginalized. So to give you one example, we actually have a public health system where you do have more than biomedicine. This is not unique. I mean, China has the same, People's Republic of China has the same system where you have a traditional Chinese medicine and a version of it as part of the public health system. India has that too, but India has many systems that it recognizes, or at least 5 or 6 of these. And so, but what has happened in recent times is Ayurveda, which is seen to be the high Hindu system, has been promoted along with yoga, and Unani, which is connected to an Islamicate identity, has been progressively marginalized. But that's not all. Within Unani, again, there's been further marginalization. So anything that's sort of grounded in a higher Islamic culture, written in Persian or Arabic has been, or even Urdu, has been valorized. And for instance, lots of less textualized healing traditions, such as one attributed to a mythical figure called Hakim Luqman, who was supposed to be a ancient mythical figure, but a lot of herbal cures are attributed to him. This was passed on orally in smaller communities. This is not high status knowledge, but this is on the grounds knowledge. This has been completely marginalized. So what decolonization once again means in the context of history of science has, first of all, changed in time, and also now this new phenomena of trying to find, which started off from a good place, I think, trying to find why is something unscientific, and is it to put it on the same platform as science. There are some liberatory aspects to it, but again, it can very easily also be co-opted into a number of internested majoritarian or elitist projects, particularly when it's hand in glove with an elite nationalist project. So once again, I'll leave it at that, but I think that's what I can see from within history of science.
Thank you so much for that enlightening answer as well, Projit. So just a reminder to our audience members, if you do have any questions specifically for the panelists or for the whole panel, please place them in the Q&A and we'll be monitoring that. And we're now just going to address the final question, which is where we ask the panelists to share an example of how they apply a perspective of decolonizing knowledge, or whatever terminology they'd like to use in their research, or to highlight an important thinker in the field of their research as well. So over to you again, Lynda.
Thank you, Kate. Decolonizing knowledge for me really involves a shift away from the Western treatment of knowledge as a static object or form of personal property. I try to think instead of knowledge as practice, to treat knowledge not as something to be acquired, but as something that arises through contact, collaboration, and exchange. 21st century Australian literature has been completely transformed by First Nations writing. It has changed the way Australians view our country. Before, Australia was a new country, founded in 1788. Now we understand that it is a country with one of the oldest living cultures in the world. First Nations authors have played an important role not only in educating readers about Australia's violent colonial history, but they have also opened up a path for Australia to throw off the shackles of a colonized mindset and embrace a unique national culture of its own. A key thinker in my field is the Wanyi author Alexis Wright. She has pioneered narrative techniques to present an Aboriginal worldview that makes concessions to Western ideology. An Alexis Wright novel is wide-ranging and epic. It tells stories in a collective way. The joy and suffering of individuals adds up to the endurance and survival of an entire people. In The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon warned against revolutions that only ended up recreating colonial hierarchies. He said, "The settler's world is a hostile world, which spurns the native, but at the same time, it is a world of which he is envious. We have seen that the native never ceases to dream of putting himself in the place of the settler, not of becoming the settler, but of substituting himself for the settler." So what I take from that is to truly decolonize means to no longer be enthralled by these colonial structures, to have the courage and vision to create something new. And Alexis Wright understands this on a fundamental level. Her frustration with the inadequacy of existing Western literary forms for conveying the Aboriginal experience has been evident from the very start of her career. And in response, she has remade the English language novel, creating a new idiom and style that has been described by Wiradjuri scholar Jenny Lane as Aboriginal realism. Alexis Wright has said that she opposes straitjackets of any kind. In a self-governing literature, she writes, "There is no world scheme that I fit into, and this means I do not want to be limited to or by other people's models or worldviews. My framework is open-ended, to be able to visit my imagination unimpeded, to live in the sovereignty of my own mind, where I own my own thoughts." This is the basis on which decolonizing knowledge begins, with a willingness to clear the ground and the confidence to listen within ourselves to the things we know to be true.
Thank you so much, Lynda. Great. Okay, over to you again, Aim.
I think since IR is not yet, well developed in terms of decolonizing enterprise, I think I have not much to share, but I would like to share about the theoretical context and debate to map out, the possibilities in doing this project. I think now among IR theories, they could not reject the realities on the pluralities of perspective in IR. As you know, the history of IR are really rigid. Perhaps only in IR we have like first debate, second debate, third debate that actually attempt to mainstream a particular perspective in this field globally. But nowadays, people celebrate this as what they call as theoretical peace, meaning that everything can be used in IR. But it resulted into a critique that IR are now being a subject of critique, that everything can be object of IR. So what the distinct feature for this discipline anymore if everything can be grabbed as IR object? So, but this context, I think, opened the space for us to think about the decolonizing project in two terms. The first one is that the pluriversalizations of perspective in IRs is the opening space for that welcome any different perspective, including decolonizing project. But it does not necessarily mean that the pluriversalizations of perspective will reduce or refuse the big tendencies of Eurocentrism in this discipline. It's just like peaceful coexistence between the dominant perspective and the minor perspective. And the second one is that the plurality of perspective also made the characters of IR become more varied. But the things need to be taken into account is that not all space have the similar chance to develop a body of knowledge production. For example, China was quite successful in developing, in the project of their decolonizing knowledge in promoting the ideas of Xinxia, the ideas of global order in China's term that root back in Confucian traditions, that is being claimed as an alternative toward Western-based rationality to China's-based relationality. And of course, it's associated with the China's material power, who would like to attempt how to play a role in the new global system with their capacity. But for the context of Indonesia and in other countries, it's hardly difficult because knowledge productions in IR are really intertwined with the political projections, especially in terms of foreign policies. So based on that context, I think when we talk about the options for decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia, I think there are three possible options. The first one is that has been developed by some scholars who advocated, a model what I call as parochial IRs, like Korean IR, Japan's IR, Pacific IR, as if they have like an essentialist and distinct features difference with other discipline. And the second one is the effort that initiated by Baribusan and Amitav Acharya, what they called as the making of global IR, meaning the efforts to combine the narrative of IR develops in the core state as well as in the peripheral state. But it does not mean, although this effort is important in the sense that it accommodates the small noise, the small voices from the small state, it does not necessarily make decolonizations means as the refusal to the dominant structures of of knowledge productions. And the third one is the thing that I think in the context of Indonesia, we need to develop a sort of model of decolonizing knowledge in IR. I don't know what the form which will look like, but at least three parameters will be important to as our guidance. The first one, decolonizing knowledge must be an ideology critic, meaning that it should be a response to unjust dominant system. It should be ideology critic. And the second one, it should be associated with the rediscovery of new subjectivity of, especially in Indonesia, because this is very important. When Indonesia economically, improving, now they are celebrated as middle income powers and so on and so forth. They play to project their roles in the global system. But what kinds of subjectivity? Which part that represented by Indonesia? And this, for example, quite vivid in many aspects. For example, in palm oil diplomacy, Indonesians palm oil are being banned by European Union, and it's now become the business of Indonesian foreign policy. But domestically, who own palm oil in Indonesia? It's just owned by small elites in Indonesia. It's it's a bad business in Indonesia, right? I think the similar case was so apply in climate diplomacy, because Indonesia, given the fact that Indonesia is archipelagic state, Indonesia tends to ally with Gulf states, to secure the dirty energy sources instead of building alliance with small and island state, given the risk of the climate crisis. The rediscovery of new subjectivity must be transparent, must be democratic, and the third parameter is the project must be emancipatory. Emancipatory meaning that it should be on the interest of the general people, not a few of elites or even the government. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Back to you, Nuntamon.
Okay. Yes. So as like applying the knowledge of decolonization or this concept to my field of study, I would say what we can do is like put the concept in the teaching of museum communication. It's about how museum communicate themselves as well, because actually look back to the formation of museum in general is happened during the colonialism to show the power. So with this point, it makes the museum kind of look like for the elite place, and then it create the perception like why we have to go to the museum, something like that. And also at some point it has the idea that museums have to change themselves from cultural legislation to cultural interpreter instead. So this means it's involve how museum communicate and who has the power to tell the story of the cultural content, especially about the indigenous content. Yeah. So with myself, like I am interested in like interpretation, museum interpretation themselves. So I try to put like the concept of decolonization in terms of how you should interpret like the content with quantity and quality and with accuracy as well, to think of like to make the content not too biased. But even though like, okay, museum shouldn't be biased, which is very idyllic, right? But for me, like with the concept of decolonization, I see it as a concept that helps museum make like inclusivity in the content, and also like with the public as well, and also make themselves like neutrality, make the neutrality as much as possible. And the last one with this like inclusivity and neutrality, especially when they communicate everything about the historic like content, they should inspire like the people or visitors when coming to the museum to search more the knowledge about that, if like to prove that okay, this museum say it's accuracy or not, or it's true or not. And then it depends on individually right now how like what they will believe, which set of the facts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nuntamon. And finally to you, Projit. And just a reminder, audience, we're going to Q&A after this, so please fire away with your questions in the Q&A. After you, Projit.
Sure. So again, like I feel that I need to know more of what decolonization is trying to achieve. And again, speaking from India, we've had a series over the last century. We've had a series of liberationist projects, from nationalism, which tried to throw out colonialism, then Marxism, then subaltern studies emerged as a strong formation, and then that began to overlap with post-colonialism, and now we have decolonization. They've all, at some level, wanted to do the same thing, but from different angles. And I feel like particularly the last two, subaltern and post-colonial, are often conflated, but they're slightly different things. And I think the subaltern project had come out from the non-delivery of the two previous projects, saying that nationalism didn't change lives as much as it had promised, and neither did Marxism in post-colonial Marxism. And so subaltern studies came out saying that we can have this relatively flexible category of the subaltern that can be interpreted contextually, and then we can ground a politics of intellectual analysis around that. The post-colonial was a slightly different project, which tried to see the persistence of the colonial in the after the demise of formal colonialism. Now, the conflation of these two, I think, has been problematic, because what we've lost sight of is where the subalternists started from, which was a critique of post-colonial state structures and entrenched elites, rather than simply trying to do a cultural decolonization. It was a more located political project. So I would love for decolonization to have that ring. And to that effect, I think we need to think of decolonization as an actors category. What have people tried to decolonize from? Who were they, and where were they? And so the book I wrote most recently is, as Kate mentioned kindly, called Brown Skins, White Coats. As you can sense, it's a bit of a homage to Frantz Fanon. And as Lynda pointed out, I mean, this is what Fanon pointed out, that people who are trying to push out the colonialists often want to just take their place. And that doesn't help much. So how do we build a more thoroughgoing critique that just doesn't change white colonialists for brown ones? And so for that, I think we need to think of decolonization as an actors category, and then see there could be many decolonizations, and what are their actual politics. And one of the things I've found in my work particularly interesting to do is the twinning of decolonization with indigeneity. Once again, I think it's a one-size-fits-all kind of framing that's problematic for me. I would like to balance that with an equally historicized interest on exogeneity. How are people seen to be outsiders and not indigenous enough? And I think that gives us those twin perspectives to think of decolonization from, as well as a historicized position of indigeneity, exogeneity, playing off each other, has been very productive for me. My own work, this book was on the use of race science after the demise of formal colonialism. So how the early Indian post-colonial state inherits and intensifies racial scientific projects, basically human genetics of various sorts, for its own eugenicist ends, nationalist eugenicist ends. And so, again, a lot of people were who was being identified as indigenous was as important as who was then being identified as exogenous and not belonging to the body politic of some kind of ahistorical, essential India. So I would just make a plug for the multiplicity of decolonizations and looking at it as an actors category and seeing what kind of concrete politics are tied to each of those articulations of decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Projit. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Israel Hollas, who's another member of our working group, who's now going to ask the panel some questions. So we're getting to you, audience, and if you've got more questions, we'll keep monitoring the chat as well. So Israel, please take us away.
All right, many thanks to the panel for the conversation. We've got our first question from Jonathan Emilio, who gives his thanks to all the speakers for their insights. And he asks a question of everyone on the panel, and that question is, what are some of the big challenges that you have faced in advocating for curriculum reforms that reflect decolonized perspectives, and how have you addressed them?
I wonder if Lynda would like to start on that one, just because you specifically mentioned curriculum before, Lynda.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
And then
Anyone want to respond first? Or? All right. Thank you for this question. I did see it when it came up, so I've been thinking about it. I'm only going to speak from in the context of the University of Melbourne, like the very specific context in which I teach, and to note that it's a very, it's a very specific point of time in Australian history. So I don't think this is normal, but at the moment at the University of Melbourne, there seems to be a top-down initiative in terms of, I mean, I suppose we would call it decolonisation, but a top-down initiative in terms of pushing everyone to undertake this curriculum revision and to try include more Indigenous or First Nations texts and perspectives. And I think, at least in our institution, the difficulty is in terms of making sure this sort of decolonisation, if we call it that, isn't done in a superficial manner. So, and I think that these are the debates that are happening in my field in terms of, how do we actually really decolonize? I suppose that's what this panel has been confronting or thinking about. Like, how do we actually do the work of decolonization rather than just adding a couple of names and saying we're done, or, ticking boxes so that we can say things are different when structurally things are the same. And at least in the Australian context, while there is more Indigenous representation in institutions, there are still many, many problems and many complaints from Indigenous people working in institutions about their treatment or the workload. So again, how do we make sure that this change happens in a genuine way, which I think may actually require some structural change in the institution.
Thank you, Lynda. Do you want to go, Nuntamon?
Yes. So with my point of view, like I think that is a challenge for me right now. It's about like how to make students understand like the concept of decolonization more. But with this point, I have to inform them like about what colonialism or decolonization is, because like with the students that I have right now, most of them are from like practice based. Like some of them work in the museum, like so they are really practice, but they might not familiar with the like academic terms or academic knowledge based on history, colonialism history that much. So for myself, like I said, what I can do is try to give them the example and then try to make them debate and encourage them to think of like what you can see, like if the term of decolonization in museum context mean this way, and what if you can do to like Thai museum context, what would you think like that we can improve the museum communication better, or improve the content that more interesting and more debatable and more inspiring? Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think we might go to the next question, unless anybody else wanted to jump in. We're okay. Maybe Israel, over to you again for the next question, just so we can give a few questions airtime.
We have a number of really well put questions. I'm going to go first with those that are open to any member of the panel, and then we'll make our way through the more granular questions. So the next question is addressed to all speakers. In what ways can Western and Indigenous knowledge systems be integrated to enrich academic disciplines without perpetuating colonial hierarchies? Any volunteers?
I think that's only happening in heaven. Meaning that the knowledge production from the very outset is always for political purposes, and yes, of course we need to admit that the levels, the politicals, baggage in every knowledge production differ from one areas to another. But in the areas like IR, I'm coming from IR department, it's highly political. There is no such thing as theory that is not oriented for political purposes. So I think that's the issues. If we acknowledge the relations between power and knowledge nexus, I think what we can do is to transparently, reveals, the ideological baggage behind every, knowledge production spaces. Yeah, thank you.
Did anybody else want to answer there?
I could go. Yeah, so what comes to mind is, I think nowadays when you're on a long drive, everybody's looking at their GPS. But back in the day, before there was GPS, there were milestones, and the good thing about that was that they keep receding. You kind of go past them, and then you keep seeing them on your rearview mirror. And I feel it's a little like that. If we think that we are going to ever solve this completely, and there's going to be some completely equitable power knowledge kind of regime, that's not going to happen. But we can always keep on doing better in our local contexts, and trying to recognizing that ideal utopia is often just receding, and it's never going to catch up. But we can still try to incorporate elements that have been marginalized, that we feel politically should be included, and those elements can be included. That's going to create new interests, and that's not going to be perfect. But we can still do that, and that could be a constructive project rather than merely a critical project, because we could bring that in, but with the understanding that it's never going to be finally achieved, and it doesn't need to be finally achieved. Things will change, the road will go on, and those milestones will remain somewhere.
Thank you, Projit. Israel, next question, maybe? Unless, Lynda, do you want to go there?
I was going to add something, especially because that question is about, it specifically talks about integration. And I just wanted to point out that I think that, as I said in my talk, I think that in itself is a sort of, it's part of the colonized mindset that is inherently Western, that we need to sort of integrate, and it sort of implies, like, can these knowledge systems be combined? Can we all end up speaking the same language? And I think language is a great way to think about that, a really decolonized mindset isn't about all learning the same language. It is that we should all actually start learning more languages, and to acknowledge that there is specific knowledge contained in each language, right? So we need to learn more. If we narrow it down just to one, we will lose all the knowledge that is contained in those other language systems.
Thank you, Lynda. Great point. Israel, do you want to go with another question?
Of course. And we have a further question about sort of questioning disciplinary boundaries, I think. So the question is from Susi Lestari Yuana, and it is, could decolonizing also mean moving beyond the linearity of disciplines, specifically in IR, international relations? How do the panelists view this idea of the multidisciplinary as parallel with the decolonial? And I would add here, maybe relevant would be ideas of being undisciplined or anti-disciplined, which are part of the decolonial literature. So any volunteers for this question? I think it is aimed at you, Aim.
Yeah, thanks, Israel, and thanks, Suchi, for bringing these questions. I think I have mapped out in my last talk when we talk about possible options when we talk about decolonizing IRs. There are some people who even go beyond the linearity of discipline of IRs, by promoting an quote unquote non-Western model of IR, but there are also people who try to build a bridge between the dominance and minor knowledge from core and periphery state. So I think that first I think that just possible options. I myself not inclined to those two kinds of models, but I'm dreaming of different models based on the three categories. By promoting the three categories, I'm not trying to build a canonizations of knowledge too, because it is it is just like the guidance for myself when we think of about decolonizing IR. And this I think relate to your second questions about the multidisciplinary in decolonizing IR. Of course, as I said, I think from the very outset, this decolonizing knowledge in Indonesia, even in discipline like IR, is not a single project. It's a multifaceted. But the things with this, with this plurality decolonizing knowledge project, I think we need to talk together to make this not only like a singles and little voices, but need to be a movement, because at the end of the day, decolonizing knowledge should be an attitude, should be a model, should be a collective actions to question the dominant structures of power that promote perpetuate injustices and violence in global politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to go back to Israel to make sure we can get around to a few more. Thank you. Thank you.
What a wonderful answer. So the next question is from Winnie Mitula, and the question is, the question of who was, is colonized, and by who is a great starting point in the discussion of decolonization. Considering the layered nature of the concept of colonization, could Mukharji and Hakim comment on why there is overconcentration on Western colonization in literature and practice?
You want to go first, Luqman?
Oh, no, please.
So my answer, thank you very much for that question. My answer would be, I think because the Americans push everything, and this decolonization agenda was also initially being pushed by them. And so this might be a cynical answer, but I feel that the way it was pushed, it became a kind of New York Times version of decolonization, which is about a neoliberal American elite now trying to find new ways of holding global power. Well, they're now the old elite. The new American elite seems to be back to the 19th century. So there was a moment in the late 20th, early 21st century, I guess, where there was a certain kind of discourse on, for instance, respecting cultures and this kind of tokenistic thing that Lynda was probably talking about. Like, I've read one non-Western author. I've got one world music album on my music shelf. And so that's why I'm very decolonized. I'm good and dandy. And I work on Wall Street, by the way, and make billions of other people's misery. So that's the kind of version of this thing that happened. And I think that became very easy to do, because then you had this image of 19th century colonialism, and decolonization was already largely a settled fact. You felt they were troglodytes on the edges who were still opposing it. Of course, they've come back with a vengeance now, but for a moment, it looked like that was a battle that was won. It was easy to do. So I thought, and I think it got promoted. And then because of the unequal power of the American academic machinery, that version of very narrowly understood colonialism and then attendant decolonization got propagated more generally. That would be my cynical view.
Thank you, Projit. Over to Ayam.
I think Projit has covered all the points.
Okay, great. Israel, do we have a number of other questions still to go?
I think that Projit has opened a can of worms here. So we have a question that is directly for him, but maybe of interest to everyone. So this question is for Professor Mukharji. I teach the history of ancient philosophy and science at Uni Melb, and I do a bit of work with Indian material. In the Australian context, teaching any Indian philosophy and science is received as decolonial, and I think there are good reasons for that. But I'm aware presenting Indian thought exclusively through Sanskrit and Pali material can serve the ends of the decidedly non-liberatory political projects you alluded to within India. Do you have any advice for how to present ancient South Asian thought in a way that doesn't feed into those narratives?
So first of all, thank you for teaching this stuff, because even teaching that seriously as part of a course is better than the kind of thing I was mentioning where you read the one translation and have that one album. And I really don't know if I even have the authority to advise on anything, because I have no special training in ancient Indian philosophy. So you probably know more, and I wouldn't want to claim that advantage just because I'm Indian. But one thing I would say is that, again, going back to something that Lynda was saying, that I think the more languages we learn, because the Sanskrit canon is also much more diverse than what it's been made out to be. It's been narrowed. One of the big tragedies is that the very people who seem to be the strongest propagators of some kind of ancient glorious Sanskrit read the least of it. And it's actually the Sanskrit canon has so much in it. And not just the canon. Why am I saying the canon? The canon formation itself is a kind of restrictive project, but there's so much of Sanskrit stuff that's quite wild and weird and diverse. And so I think that kind of exactly like reading that material, getting into some of that material. I work on history of medicine, and even if you take the most canonical Ayurvedic text, the Charaka Samhita, the sections on midwifery, for instance, are fascinating. And it's because that's something that the high Brahmin male authors who would write it, who contributed most of it, probably didn't know much about, and were so that's where you get the wacky stuff, the demons, the all the magic, the stuff that's not as clearly coded as upper caste elite male knowledge that's got into it. So even within the same one text. So I think there are kind of reading strategies as well. And that goes back to like knowing the language and reading more of it than the narrowed down blurby version that's in a reader somewhere. So, but again, I want to just thank you for even teaching this in Australia.
Thank you so much. And Israel, just wondered if there were any specific questions for Nuntamon and Lynda as well, or something more directed to them. I know you've got a hard job sifting through the questions there.
We've just had a couple of new questions come in, and I don't know how to pronounce this word, midwifery, but I just want to acknowledge that there is an anonymous comment about midwifery in Thailand, which possibly we won't have time to get to because it's a comment more so than a question. There is a further question about whether or not the Cold War could have had some effect on the current debates around decolonization and decolonial subjectivities, is the term used in the question. So I'll leave that in the background in case anyone wants to respond to that. And we have a further question for the panelists, which is really a two-part question. Let's see how much time we have. In the field of social sciences and humanities, how can scholars from the Global South play a more active role in shaping the direction of knowledge decolonization, particularly in sociology and social theory? And the second point, in the context of higher education, how can social science curricula be designed to better reflect perspectives from the diverse regions of the world, rather than being predominantly centered on Europe and Anglo-America?
I would answer for the one about the midwifery questions. Then this is another example of the issues if the museum have to communicate the specific cultural practice like this, and as this person said about some practice in midwifery, it sounds probably sounds like horrendous, and I can't imagine what would it be because I think it's a kind of shared culture or shared knowledge about this, the practice among Southeast Asia or Asia. So I would say answer in terms of if museum have to do how I say convey the message about this, it's the way that museum have to find a way to communicate with the less horrific way, like I said, make it neutral, but and make it kind of non-biased way. Yeah, you can just it's the tone of the text as well, even though you don't make it as an oral communication like via the video or the audio way, but with the basic communication way or interpretation for the museum is a text right in the panel. The curator or the one who do the communicating have to find the not jargon, no jargon word, and make the word is really neutral as much as possible, and make it kind of neutral. Sorry, like I keep saying neutral, but it's like at the end, make it neutral, but at the end, you can say like leave it as at the end of the text and say, what would it feel like, or make it in the question way, not as an open-end question way, to make the visitors like wants to find out more and think back if they were in that situation, what would they do, or how would they feel, like to create like, yeah, not present that in the bad way. Yes.
I just wondered, we're really getting close to the end of time. We should really end soon. But Lynda, did you want to make any final comment on that question? Because it was two-parted about also scholars from the Global South, maybe in terms of curriculum work, or I don't know, is it everybody's homework also to balance their curriculums as well?
I was going to say, especially because that seems very much geared more geared towards social science.
Yep.
And I am just real, literature is pure humanities. But I did want to say, as someone who comes from the humanities, and this is part of decolonization, but in terms of recognizing different things as knowledge or different objects as knowledge, and I think that is one of the struggles we in the humanities have with the dominance of science, that scientific knowledge is valued, and at least in the West, fields like literature are now seen more as entertainment or excess or unnecessary. But as I raised Alexis Wright's work, I think what a lot of contemporary writers are teaching us or showing us is that knowledge comes in very different forms. It becomes even more important, I think, from environmental perspectives, where we're more attuned to the need for biodiversity, and that it really affects us to have everything, our definition of knowledge, whittled down only to very narrow scientific terms. So in response to that question, broadening your sense, or which we all should be doing, being more open to different forms of knowledge, or being willing to recognize different things as knowledge.
Thank you so much, Lynda. And I think that I'm going to conclude there, because people may be wanting to get off for different activities in their day. I know we're on different time zones here, but I would like to thank all of our panelists for a fantastic session. And I hope everybody who stayed on to listen till the end has enjoyed this. And I'm glad we got to hear many of your questions. So thank you very much to our panelists, and we'll be announcing again when our second panel is running with the other members of the Global Humanities Alliance. But thank you again for joining us tonight. It was wonderful to have you here, and thank you to the panelists. Good evening.
Thanks everyone.